They sell the idea that retirement is some kind of golden reward, a serene harbor after the long race. For Arthur Corrigan, however, it was just quiet. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a library or a sleeping city. It was a cavernous, oppressive quiet. This was the kind of silence that's so loud it hurts, amplifying the echoes of every moral shortcut he had ever taken, every relationship he had casually discarded in his relentless climb to the top. He was Arthur Corrigan, after all, the man who built half of Chicago's skyline, or so the well-rehearsed line went at cocktail parties. His entire life had been constructed like one of his skyscrapers, a formidable fortress built on the unyielding bedrock of pride and logic. There was no room for the unpredictable messiness of deep emotion, and certainly not for his father, Liam. Liam was a ghost long before he died, a man who had chosen the warm embrace of a bottle over his own family, eventually vanishing without a trace into the vast, empty plains of South Dakota. So when the formal, impersonal letter arrived announcing that Liam was gone for good, it didn't feel like a loss. Arthur felt no grief, only a flicker of annoyance. It was just a loose thread from a past he'd meticulously cut away, a final, messy bit of business that required snipping. With a sigh of resignation, he climbed into the cool, leather-scented interior of his pristine Mercedes, a vehicle that was the very antithesis of the world he was driving toward. The engine purred to life as he guided the car onto the highway, pointing its silver nose toward a place he'd spent a lifetime and a small fortune trying to forget: Redemption Creek. He wasn't going there to mourn or to reminisce. He was there to liquidate his father's ghost, to sell the broken-down, debt-ridden ranch he'd been left with. It was, in his mind, one final, irritating chore. As the sleek car finally rolled to a stop on a gravel path, the destination looked even worse than his bleakest memories had suggested. The house sagged, its paint peeling away in large flakes like sunburnt skin, the wood beneath weathered and grey. Taped crookedly to the front door was a foreclosure notice, its paper already curling and yellowing in the relentless dry air. Perfect, Arthur thought, a grim satisfaction settling in his chest. Just another piece of derelict proof, a final confirmation from the universe that he had been right about his father all along. Follow Arthur's journey into a past he tried to bury. Subscribe for cinematic storytelling, complex characters, and a powerful tale of redemption. Don't miss a single chapter. I should have just called a disposal company, but something made me step inside. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old wood and something else. Turpentine, maybe. On a small, rickety table sat a single envelope. It stood out against the grime, clean and white. My name was on it, written in a graceful, steady hand. It wasn't from a lawyer, but from a woman named Alara, a local history teacher. She wrote about my father, Liam, and a promise he'd made to her grandfather, an old shaman named Samuel Stands Tall. A promise tied to this very land, this dirt I was so eager to get off my hands. I almost laughed. Promises. I deal in contracts, in blueprints with clear lines and figures, not in campfire stories and spiritual debts. This was exactly the kind of sentimental nonsense that drove my father out of the real world. I crumpled the letter, my mind made up. I pulled out my phone and found a local realtor, Wes. He sounded young, ambitious, and refreshingly unsentimental. "A developer is buying up parcels out here," he said, his voice slick and confident. "We can get this done, Mr. Corrigan. A quick, clean sale." His words were music to my ears. Finally, someone who spoke my language. He was the bulldozer I needed to flatten this final piece of my past. The crumpled letter felt like a hot coal in my pocket as I walked through the rest of the dilapidated house. Wes had already emailed the preliminary paperwork, his efficiency a cool balm on the irritation Ilara's note had caused. Each room was a testament to my father's detachment from my world. Instead of financial records, there were shelves of rocks and feathers. Instead of a television, a large, unfinished canvas of a dark sky over the very hills outside. In a crate beneath star maps, I found a small, leather-bound journal. I almost tossed it, but his initials, LC, were embossed in faded gold. Curiosity, a traitorous emotion, made me open it. The pages held precise sketches of plants and animals, notes in my father's neat script. He wasn't just living here, he was studying it. Then I found the entry. Samuel says the heart of the land is near the old oak. It sleeps, but the hollow men are coming. Their machines are loud, they do not listen. My promise is to be its shield, a pact made not in words, but in shared silence. Hollow men. The phrase snagged in my mind. Was he talking about me? About the developer Wes was so eager to please? The thought was absurd, yet it clung to me. My phone buzzed, shattering the dusty silence. It was Wes. "Good news, Mr. Corrigan," he chirped. "The offer is solid. They want to close by the end of the month. Just need your signature." I looked from the phone to the journal in my other hand, at a careful drawing of an owl whose eyes held a silent question. A quick, clean sail, a shield. My father's promise against my own. The ink on both felt suddenly impossibly heavy. While he waited for Wes to handle the legalities, a process that felt agonizingly slow, he began the task of clearing out the house. His mission was purely pragmatic, to unearth a deed, a title, any document that would expedite the sale and sever his final tie to the place. He moved with a brusque efficiency, sorting through the detritus of his father's last years. It was mostly junk. Piles of old clothes, empty bottles tucked away in shadowed corners like whispered confessions. Each object was an unwanted anchor to a past he was determined to liquidate. Then, in the back of a closet, he found a dusty footlocker. Annoyance pricked at him, another container of memories to be discarded. But upon prying open the stiff metal clasps, he found not junk, but sketchbooks. Dozens of them, filled with his father's drawings. At first, he felt only a fresh wave of irritation. It was just another distraction. A reluctant curiosity, however, compelled him to open one. The pages revealed a profound and meticulous study of the surrounding world. His father had drawn the land, the sky, the shifting light. He had captured the precise angle at which the wind bent the tall grass, and rendered the complex, layered architecture of clouds gathering before a storm. It was all executed with an obsessive focus, a rigorous attention to structure and form that the architect instantly recognized. It was the very same discipline he poured into his own blueprints. This was not idle doodling, but a language he hadn't anticipated finding here, a dialect of lines and shadows he understood perfectly. It was the language of a builder. He kept turning the pages, a strange reverence replacing his initial haste, and then he saw it, a detailed sketch of a single twisted pine tree on a low hill, its gnarled branches reaching for the sky like weathered fingers. He stared at the image, a cold sensation crawling up the back of his neck. The drawing wasn't just impressive, it felt intensely, inexplicably familiar. For the first time since his arrival, the cold, hard certainty he had wrapped around himself like a shield began to feel fragile, a little less solid. The image of the tree stuck with him, an itch he couldn't scratch. This newfound curiosity, a tiny, illogical crack in his foundation, pushed him to look further. He wasn't just clearing out junk anymore, he was searching. Behind a loose floorboard in his father's bedroom, he found a small cedar chest. Prying it open, he half expected to find more empty promises, but it held no money or trinkets. Inside were letters from his mother. He stood frozen, reading her familiar handwriting on page after page, all dated years after she claimed to have cut his father out of their lives completely. The letters weren't angry. They were filled with a sorrow so deep, it felt as if he were drowning in it. She wrote of his father's struggle to get sober, and of letters meant for him that she had never sent. The woman he knew hadn't been strong and decisive, protecting her son from an absent father. She had been scared. Unable to face his new, fragile sobriety, She had pushed the man away, building a wall of lies brick by brick between a boy and his dad. The central truth of his life, the abandonment that had fueled his rage and ambition, was a story she had invented. He was left standing in the dust of his father's life with nothing to hold on to, his anger suddenly, utterly, without a home. His world was tilted on its axis, a foundation built on anger and resentment now crumbling into dust. For his entire life, he had been running from the ghost of his father, a specter of disappointment and abandonment. Now he understood that the ghost was nothing more than a scarecrow, crudely stitched together by his own mother's deceptions. He needed answers, real ones, not the carefully constructed fictions he had been fed. The name from the crumpled, tear-stained letter echoed in his mind. Ilara. He found her just as the letter had said he would, in the quiet humility of the small community school. The man who walked through the door was not the arrogant Chicago developer who had arrived days earlier, full of purpose and condescension. This was a man hollowed out, who had just felt the solid ground of his own history fall away into a chasm. "I think you were right," he said. The words, a raw admission, barely a greeting. He leaned against the doorframe, the last of his certainty gone. "About the promise. I need to understand." Ilara didn't press him for more. She simply regarded him with a quiet, knowing patience that felt ancient, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Her compassion was a balm he hadn't known he needed. "My grandfather, Samuel, knew your father better than anyone here," she said softly, her voice a gentle anchor in his storm. "You should talk to him." The drive to the edge of the reservation was a blur of dust and fading light, mirroring the chaos in his own thoughts. Ilara led him to a small, neat house where an elderly man, Samuel stands tall, sat on his porch as if carved from the very landscape. His eyes were clouded with age, filmed over by the passage of countless seasons, but as the developer sat down, a profound and unnerving sensation washed over him. He felt utterly transparent, as if Samuel's gaze bypassed his physical form and saw straight into the tangled mess of his soul, witnessing every lie he'd ever told himself. Samuel listened as the younger man stumbled through his story, the words catching in his throat. A fractured narrative of a life lived in the shadow of a lie. When the confession finally exhausted itself into silence, the old man remained quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice low and resonant, like stones smoothed by an eternal river. "The invisible wound you carry," Samuel said, his gaze piercing right through him. "It was not made by your father." The words landed with the silent, shattering force of truth. In that moment, the entire purpose of his trip, the very idea of selling the land, became the most meaningless thing in the world. Just as Arthur began to feel he was forging a new path, the past reached out with an unyielding grip. His phone buzzed, a summons from the life he was desperately trying to leave behind. It was Wes, the realtor, his voice slick with the kind of salesman charm that set Arthur's teeth on edge. "Art, my man, great news!" Wes's enthusiasm felt hollow. He spoke of a fantastic offer from a developer, a group that loved the location and wanted to close the deal within the week. He dangled the promise of top dollar, a phrase that only days ago would have represented a triumphant victory. Now, it just felt wrong, a sour note in the quiet melody of his new existence. The seed of this unease had been planted earlier during a conversation with Ilara. As he was leaving Samuel's, he had casually mentioned the developer's interest. A shadow had crossed her features. "Be careful, Arthur," she had cautioned, her brow furrowed with a concern that felt ancient and profound. She told him of the sacred burial sites that consecrated that land, places her grandfather worried over with a fierce, protective spirit. Then, she had added something else, a detail that seemed incidental at the moment, but would soon prove to be the key to everything. "He told me a story once," she'd said, her voice dropping, "about your father's old business partner in Chicago, a man named Thompson. Liam always felt a great sadness for what happened to him. The name landed like a physical blow, stealing the air from Arthur's lungs. Thompson. It was a ghost from a story he barely knew. A sudden, chilling premonition made him reach for his phone, his fingers fumbling as he scrolled through his contacts. The realtor's full name came into focus: Wesley Thompson, Jr. The world tilted on its axis. This was no longer a simple real estate deal. It was a meticulously crafted echo of a long-buried conflict, a reckoning decades in the making. This wasn't business. This was personal. This was revenge. He drove to Wes's office, a small, modern box standing out against the town's main street. Walking in, he dispensed with pleasantries. "Your father was Al Thompson, wasn't he?" The effect was instantaneous. The slick smile vanished from Wes's face. In a blink, the friendly realtor was gone, replaced by a man with cold, hard eyes. "So you finally figured it out," Wes said, leaning back in his chair, his voice flat and devoid of its earlier charm. "Your father left a lot of messes back in Chicago. My family was one of them. He came here to run and hide, but you can't outrun what you did." The revelation hung in the air. Wes wasn't there to broker a deal. He was there to settle a score. He confessed with a palpable satisfaction that twisted his features that he had already been in touch with the bank. He had used his intimate knowledge of the father's old financial troubles, a hidden history of debt and failure, to paint the property as an unsalvageable liability. "The foreclosure is a sure thing now," he said, a cruel smirk confirming his victory. "And that developer? He's got no patience for historical preservation. He'll bulldoze whatever he needs to." It was a masterstroke of cruelty, a meticulously planned attack aimed not just at the son, but at the memory of his father and the people he had come to respect. As he stared at Wes's cynical ambition, he saw a hideous reflection of the man he himself used to be. The walls were closing in on Arthur Corrigan. He felt cornered, a feeling of being trapped not by physical barriers, but by the converging pressures of Wes, the bank, and a past that was unraveling into something utterly unrecognizable. Just as the weight of it all threatened to crush him, his phone vibrated, a jarring buzz against the worn wood of the table. The screen lit up with a single name: Jason, his son. Answering the call, Arthur was met with a voice that was both intimately familiar and chillingly distant. It traveled across thousands of miles from a sun-drenched Californian reality. A voice saturated with the easy, unshakable confidence of a young tech bro on the verge of his next big success. Jason cut straight to the point, dispensing with pleasantries. "Dad, I heard there was a hiccup with that property sale." There was no warmth or empathy in the tone, only a problem-solving efficiency that made Arthur's stomach clench. "Look, just take the deal and get out of there. It's a dirt patch in the middle of nowhere." Each word was a clinical assessment, completely devoid of the emotional history Arthur now knew the land held. Then came the killing blow, delivered with the casual cruelty of youth. "You're the one who always taught me to be pragmatic, to cut your losses and move on. My startup is in a critical phase. I can't afford any distractions." Hearing his own cold, calculated dogma thrown back in his face was like a physical punch to the gut. It was more than just his son's words. It was the disembodied echo of a man he had spent years trying to bury. The ghost of Arthur Corrigan past had been resurrected, speaking through the digital connection, its voice channeled through his own son, as if through a medium. This was the ghost who measured worth purely in dollars and square footage, who saw land as a line item and emotion as a liability. The chasm between the man he was desperately trying to become and the cold, pragmatic father his son still saw him as suddenly felt a mile wide. It was another generational silence, a void he had unknowingly forged with his own past indifference, painfully reminiscent of the vast, quiet distance that had long separated him from Liam. Overwhelmed, he drove back to the ranch house, the only place that still felt real. Searching for anything to hold on to, he went straight for the sketchbooks, spreading them across the dusty floor. He was looking for a clue, an answer, and among the sketches he found it, a worn leather journal, his father's. He opened it carefully, its pages filled with notes, fragments of thoughts and more drawings. And then he saw it, a finely detailed drawing of that same twisted pine on the hill, the one he recognized. The sight prompted an instinctual reaction. He pulled out the small notebook he always carried, a habit from his architect days, and flipped it open without thinking. On a back page, doodled from memory just a few days prior, was the very same tree. The sketch was almost identical. The same gnarled branches, the same defiant angle against the sky. It was a silent conversation he hadn't even known they were having. A sudden, profound realization washed over him. They saw the world the same way. They had the same architect's eye, the same soul. With trembling hands, he began to read the journal. The weathered pages contained not the disjointed ramblings of a man in hiding, but a stark and meticulously detailed confession. His father's script filled the volume, recounting his former life in Chicago, a story not just of ambition, but of catastrophic failure. The long-held narrative concerning Wes's father, Al Thompson, was swiftly dismantled. It wasn't the whole truth. While professional disagreements had certainly soured their relationship, they were merely a convenient veil for the real, devastating rupture. The single mistake that had haunted his father to his final days. The true source of his torment, the ghost he could never escape, involved someone else entirely. The ink on the page seemed to bleed with regret as it revealed the core of the tragedy. The business partner whose life his father had inadvertently shattered, whose family had endured a devastating emotional and financial collapse after a deal went disastrously wrong, was none other than Ilara's father. The revelation struck him with the force of a physical blow, rearranging the entire landscape of his past. His father hadn't come to Redemption Creek to cower from the Thompsons. He had come seeking penance. He had journeyed to this remote corner of the world to atone, to try and repay an impossible debt to the family he had wronged so profoundly. The cryptic promise he had made to Samuel was not some grand spiritual quest, but a desperate, humble attempt at restitution. He was trying to give back the only thing of value he had left, this land. The weight of this inherited truth settled upon him, a complex and crushing emotional architecture, far heavier than any building he had ever constructed. The staggering truth had barely begun to settle in his mind when the world he knew fell away completely. Wes, having evidently snooped and found the journal before him, had wasted no time in using its contents to deliver a final, crushing blow. The official foreclosure notice arrived, a stark and impersonal final word. The ranch was gone. As he stood there, the paper trembling slightly in his hand, his phone shattered the daze. It was Jason. His son's voice came through the line, strained and panicked, a torrent of words tumbling out. He had done something terrible. He had sold the house, the one in Chicago, to secure emergency funding for his startup. The devastating act was born from a fatal miscalculation, the assumption that his father's retirement and the sale of the ranch would leave him more than comfortable. In the span of a single afternoon, every pillar of his identity had been demolished. He had lost the ranch, the last tangible vestige of his father. He had lost his home, the monument he had painstakingly built to his own success. He had lost his money and the status that came with it. He was left financially, emotionally, and spiritually bankrupt. All that remained of his entire life were a sketchbook, a journal, and the suffocating silent weight of 2 generations of misjudgment. That night, inside the dark, hollowed-out shell of the ranch house, the silence had a different texture. It was unlike the suffocating quiet of his Chicago penthouse, heavy with unspoken expectations, nor was it the tense, watchful silence of his first days on the property. This was something else entirely, the absolute profound stillness of rock bottom. He had nothing left. The life he had so meticulously built was gone. No home, no money, no vaunted identity as a successful builder. Everything had been stripped away. As he sat on the dusty floor, a journal clutched in one hand and his father's sketchbook in the other, he felt a void where his ambition used to be. Yet, in that gaping emptiness, a strange and unexpected clarity began to crystallize. He understood then that his father's true legacy was never about a land deed or some forgotten bank account. It was here, tangible and real, in the charcoal lines that filled the pages of the sketchbook. His lines and his father's intertwined across time. They were two men, separated by a lifetime of lies and emotional distance, yet they had drawn the very same tree, had seen and captured the same quality of light in the vast sky. The promise his father had made to Samuel was not a business transaction. It was a desperate attempt to heal a deep wound he himself had inflicted. His father had been unable to finish what he started. But as the realization settled in the quiet room, a new thought took root. Maybe he could. The following day, a meeting was convened at the tribal center that felt less like a negotiation and more like a verdict. Wes was present, flanked by a man in a suit Corrigan presumed was the developer, both radiating an air of smug victory. They possessed the foreclosure papers, the contracts, the law itself. Against this, Corrigan walked in armed with nothing but his father's journal and sketchbook. As he approached the elders' table, Wes smirked. "A little late for a sob story, Corrigan. The deal is done." Corrigan ignored him. His eyes found Samuel, then Ilara, whose face was a carefully constructed mask of strained composure. "I don't have a legal argument," he began, his voice holding a surprising steadiness. "I don't have anything, really, except the truth." He set the journal aside, unopened. Instead, he opened the sketchbook. From its pages, he began to tell a story not of real estate or legal disputes, but of a man who saw the world in lines and light. A man who had come to this land not to hide from his life, but to try and draw his way back to himself. Her fingers turned the page, revealing a stark drawing of a twisted pine. It was time. Her gaze lifted, moving from a bewildered Wes to an expectant Ilara, and she explained that her father's quest for atonement was for a mistake made long ago. The long-standing issues between their fathers, she clarified, were a distraction from the real truth. The debt her father had come here to repay was never owed to Wes's family. With hands that were surprisingly steady, she finally opened the old journal. Her eyes found Ilara's, holding them as she delivered the final devastating revelation. The debt was owed to Ilara's family. A soft, collective gasp cut through the stillness of the room as she recounted the story buried in the journal's pages. A ruinous business deal, a partnership that had cost Ilara's family their fortune, a quiet suffering they had carried in silence for decades. Just as Wes started to protest, she silenced him, retrieving one last thing from a hidden pocket in the journal's cover. It was a folded, yellowed piece of paper. The original deed to the ranch, legally and irrevocably signed over to Liam Corrigan. The document was proof. The ranch was hers. In that moment, she held all the power. She could fight, sue Wes for his malicious interference, and claim her pound of flesh. It would be a justified revenge, a righteous victory. But her gaze fell upon Ilara, upon the profound relief washing over her face as a lifetime of silent questions were finally answered. In that look, she knew what she had to do. Arthur Corrigan circled the heavy oak table, the weight of the old deed in his hand, feeling far greater than that of mere paper. It was a physical manifestation of a generational wrong, a heavy inheritance he was finally ready to relinquish. He stopped before Ilara, her gaze steady and unreadable. The air in the room was thick with unspoken history, with the quiet defiance of a community that had endured. Without a word, he extended his hand and gently placed the folded, brittle document into hers. Her fingers brushed against his, a fleeting, cool touch. "He came here to make this right," Arthur said, the words catching in his throat. A tremor ran through his voice, a profound crack appearing in the stoic dam he had spent a lifetime constructing. Behind it, a lifetime of detached solitude and inherited guilt threatened to surge forth. Let me help him finish his story. Forgiveness. For an architect who dealt in concrete plans and rigid structures, it was an alien concept, a design he had never known how to draft. He built walls that divided spaces and people. He had never learned the engineering of the heart. Weeks later, the transfer was a memory, replaced by the quiet process of mending. Arthur stood with Ilara and Samuel on the hill, beside the ancient twisted pine that had witnessed so much. There were no lawyers in sharp suits, no performative speeches. It was simply them, surrounded by the quiet, powerful presence of their community, who stood as witnesses on their ancestral land, their hill. The setting sun bathed the landscape in a soft, golden light, a stark contrast to the harsh legalities that had once defined this very spot. Samuel, a man whose face was a map of his people's resilience, turned to Arthur. He offered a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture that transcended words, a profound act of grace. It was more than forgiveness for past sins. It was acceptance into their present. In that single silent moment, the immense weight Arthur had carried for so long simply dissolved. He wasn't Arthur Corrigan, the lauded architect from Chicago, a man defined by blueprints and cold steel. That persona felt like a stranger's suit of clothes. He was just art, a man finally learning the simple yet infinitely complex art of drawing a bridge instead of a wall. The suffocating silence of his former life was gone, replaced by the gentle murmur of a living legacy, not one of buildings and monuments but of connection and of peace.